Hey, it's Brooke. I'm back with the next video in our homeostasis series. So, this time we're going to be taking a look at cellular transport. And I know that at first blush, it doesn't necessarily seem like cellular transport has anything to do with homeostasis. But as we discovered during the case study that we worked at around the fella that got lost out in the desert and got really dehydrated, water balance is an example of where cellular transport is playing an integral role. And many other functions that are happening within your body are happening at the cellular level and happening across a membrane. And so that's what we're going to take a look at here in this video. In our next video, we're going to talk a lot more about how cells will signal to one another and how those signals are processed. Okay, so the big idea here is that cells are the thing that's responsible for maintaining an organism's homeostasis. And so the cells have these really highly regulated systems and mechanisms to allow things to come in and go out of the cell, and even communication within the parts of a cell, within the different organelles. And so we're going to do a little bit of a refresher. And for some of you, this may be news or something you haven't thought about since ninth grade biology. Others of you may be a lot more familiar with this, and you can feel free to turn me on to triple speed or whatever you need to do. So let's just start with the basic, just as a reminder that the cell membrane consists of a selectively permeable phospholipid bilayer, and it gets to control what goes in and out. And when we're talking about a phospholipid bilayer, what we mean is we've got these little balls here that have the two little legs that are coming down. Those little guys are the phospholipid, and they make a little sandwich. So in this sandwich, the center of this is hydrophobic, meaning it doesn't like water, and then the outside and the inside of the cell are hydrophilic, meaning that they can interact with water. And then within this cell membrane, we have these proteins that are embedded. And the proteins that are embedded have many functions, but the ones that we're going to pay closest attention to are those that function as a channel or a tunnel for things to get in and out of the cell. All right, so just a recap, and then I'm going to go into the different types of passive and active transport. More specifically, but just to remind you that things can move in and out of the cell passively, which means that they don't require any energy. Molecules are moving down the concentration gradient. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, if we look at this picture here, this blue side is the outside of the cell and the brown side is the inside of the cell. It just means that there's more stuff on the outside. So this stuff can move down the gradient, down the mountain. I think of it as like a river, right? A river can flow down the mountain without really any help at all. But it'd be really hard for us to get that water back up the mountain, going up against that concentration gradient. And so that's how I like to think of it. So in these examples here, we're looking at transport that's happening from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And that just happens spontaneously. But if we were starting to try to go the other direction, like what we're seeing here, if you notice these little triangles, we have very few triangles outside the cell and a whole bunch on the inside. I guess they're not triangles, are they? Those are diamonds. It's been a long day. We actually are going to need some energy to go against the grain here to get that river back up the mountain, so to speak. And we're going to talk more about what those possible ways are for a cell to move stuff against that grain, against the gradient. Okay, so just a recap, we're going to just cover some new not new vocabulary, review some vocabulary with you and review some concepts that you may have covered in ninth grade biology or maybe have already thought about in advanced bio. Okay, so when we're talking about simple diffusion, what we're talking about is just the spreading out of molecules across a membrane until equilibrium is reached. So that means that we're going from high to low, areas of greater concentration to areas of lesser concentration. And really small non-polar molecules are able to just go straight through the phospholipid bilayer. They don't need a channel. They don't need any help. It just happens. So if we're looking at this example here, we have our area of high concentration, and these molecules are going to want to go downhill to the area of low concentration, and over time, equilibrium is going to be achieved. They're going to be equal. Okay, so if something has a charge or it's too big, it's going to require a channel. Sorry, a transport protein to act as a channel. And that's going to facilitate the diffusion of molecules that normally just couldn't get across there because they're too big or they have charges. And we can also see transport proteins that also act as carriers. So they're going to bind substances to carry them across the membrane. An example of that type of membrane protein is one that helps with glucose. So here's our picture again. It's still diffusion. We're still going from our area of high concentration to our area of low concentration. We're just getting a little assist here from the channel, and that's why we say it's been facilitated. And over time, we're going to reach equilibrium. Okay, water is a special case of simple diffusion, and it gets its own special word. We call it osmosis. And then we're also going to talk more about water balance, and we're going to be using a word tonicity to describe how the water is balanced inside and outside of a cell. So we know that water is going to move from areas of high water concentration, which means that it's a low concentration of a solute. This little symbol here, the two closed parentheses, if you remember from chemistry, helps us remember that or reminds us that they're talking about the concentration, how much of something there is. So if we're going from high water concentration to areas of low concentration, that means that we're going from a low solute to high concentration. I know I sound like I'm talking circularly, but let me tell you how I remember this. And I think of it as the water likes to go where the party is, right? So in this pool party that we're having here on this side of the membrane, we've got all these solutes on this side. They're having a great time. There aren't so many solutes on this side. So the water is going to want to move across that membrane to go to where the party is. And eventually what we would see is that the water would just continue flowing across there until the distribution of those of the concentration seem to be equal. And just a reminder, concentration just means like how much stuff is in water. Okay, so when we're thinking about osmosis, there's one more level that we need to consider. And this is something that's really important in the context of physiology, because as physicians or other types of healthcare providers, we're going to be providing medicines that are, molecules and work on the cellular level. And so this is something that we really want to take seriously or take into consideration. So if we're putting a cell into a solution that is hypertonic, it means that the concentration of water is lower than the cell's cytoplasm. Or another way to think about that is there's more stuff outside the cell than inside the cell. Water is going to want to leave that cell and it's going to shrink. If the cell is put into a solution where there's more water outside, in other words, all the stuff is on the inside of the cell, water is going to want to go where the party is, and the water is going to move into the cell, and the cell will swell up, or in some cases, it can even burst. In an isotonic solution, it just means that the water concentration is equal on either side of that membrane. So inside and outside the cell are the same. So looking at this a different way, we have Okay, so here's another way to look at this. So here we've got a lot of water concentration, or sorry, a lot of water inside the cell and not as much outside the cell. So the water is going to want to go from its area of high concentration to low concentration, or it's going to want to move to where the party is. So it's going to want to leave the cell and our cell's going to shrivel up. Here's our hypotonic situation. So there's a whole bunch of solutes inside the cell, which means that there's not very much water inside the cell. So the water is going to want to go from its higher concentration outside to inside the cell. Or another way to say that is it wants to go where the party is. And so it's going to move into the cell and the cell is going to swell up. Okay, and then this is our body's preferred condition, and this is where cells will stay the same. And I may have mentioned this to some of you when we were working on our case study about being lost in the desert, that sometimes we'll use a medical provider might use a hypotonic solution to help water get back into the cells if a patient is really dehydrated. It can help with increasing blood pressure. All right, so now we're going to switch away from all of those processes that happen passively and talk about that other situation where we're going against a gradient. So we're trying to get the water back up the mountain of the river from where the river flowed down. So a cell is going to use energy to do this, and it's going to be pumping molecules across a membrane. So it's going to be using energy to get against this gradient, and most of the time it uses a protein channel. We're going to talk about an exception in a little bit. And so we're going to say that one molecule of ATP is actually used to move 2 potassium and 3 sodium in something called the sodium potassium pump. And that is something that is used in every single one of your neurons, your nerve cells in your body, to make an electrical signal take place. And so we're going to be using energy to make that happen, and we're pumping potassium out of the cell, and you'll see that over time we end up with that more potassium out of the cell than inside of the cell. And here's another way to look at that. So sodium's coming in, potassium's heading out, and we're using ATP to make that happen. Okay, so here's the other way active transport can take place, and that's using something called vesicles. And a vesicle is essentially where a cell has used its membrane to kind of surround something, and it makes like a little bubble within a bubble. And when we're talking about something entering the cell, like if our white blood cells are creeping around and they come across a pathogen in our body, they're going to engulf it. And they do that by spreading their cell membrane around the pathogen and bringing it inside to digest it. And to do that, we have to form vesicles out of the cell membrane. And I think that you'll remember, or you'll get to try this out in class, where we'll use membranes made out of soap bubbles and see what happens when you blow bubbles into it. Okay, so the opposite, where something's exiting a cell, is called exocytosis. And this happens when a cell is creating a product that is too big to get out of the cell without it doesn't fit through a cell protein channel, and it just needs to get out. So the cell will use a plasma membrane, so something that was from one of the organelles that produced this substance. So let's say it's sweat from a sweat gland, and it's going to bring that vesicle up to the edge, and that vesicle is going to fuse with the edge of the cell membrane, and it's going to release that product, in this case, out into the skin. Sometimes it's a hormone that's being released directly into the bloodstream, or there's lots of different examples that we can talk about where exocytosis is happening inside our bodies. Oh, sorry, here's another example. So, when nerve cells are releasing neurotransmitters to send signals across a synapse at the end of a neuron, where a neuron is communicating with another nerve cell, or it's communicating with a gland, or maybe even a muscle, it's using that process. All right, that is the end of this show or this slideshow on cellular transport. We've got one more for this unit on cellular signaling, so how cells communicate with each other and within themselves, and that will wrap up the rest of this unit. All right, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you in class.